Welcome back from the break, and good morning to all of you in North America that hopefully have joined us by now. We are getting ready for the third and last session of today's program. Essentially, as the name implies, Drive Sweden is a national system, but we all need globally applicable solutions, as we have noted many times already today. And all our partners are also looking to grow internationally. So therefore, internationalization has become a very important horizontal activity within the program for a long time. We mentioned our relation to Singapore and in Europe in the previous sessions, but if you need to learn from the best, and particularly if you look at technology, what part of the world could be more important to liaise with than Silicon Valley? So since about a year ago, we are established there as well. We have one person based in Silicon Valley acting on behalf of Drive Sweden, Elias Arnestrand, and we are also a member of the Nordic Innovation House that we will hear more about later. So with that, we'll kick off this North American session, Sophie.
Yes, exactly. As Janne said, it's very important, the international aspects, but also the systematic approach that we are working with to tackling the future mobility challenge. That's also crucial. And these are our 5 thematic areas. I showed them also earlier, and we have been focusing today a lot on business models. The last sessions was about policy development. We've talked about engaging the need to engage the public, and this session will dive quite deep into the digital infrastructure and data sharing, but also on society planning and how AI and mobility how AI can be an enabler for more sustainable mobility. But before starting off with the speakers, we would like to remind you that please write questions if you have any in the chat, and we will bring them up as much as we have time to. And our first speaker that we are very happy to invite will be Timothy Papandreou from the Emerging Transport Advisors. After that, we will hear from Emily Eros, Shared Streets, Universes, a discussion on how AI can exactly enable for sustainable mobility, about our SME platform, and we will end at 5 o'clock Central European Time. So, Timothy Papandreou, he is the founder of Emerging Transport Advisors, and he has nearly 2 decades of global experience in moving people and things from, for example, Google X and Waymo. And we look very much forward to his insights to what the world needs to be prepared for from his Silicon Valley perspective. So a warm welcome, Timothy, to Drive Sweden Forum. And now your mic is not on yet.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, evening, wherever you all are in the world. It's been great to hear from you all. I was just remarking about the time for us here in the Bay Area. I wouldn't think anything of waking up at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock to get on a plane and go to work or do some sort of 1.5 hour train ride. And because I haven't done this for 6 months now, it actually hurts to wake up early. So it's one of those things that's been a very big change for, I think, for a lot of us as we've dealt with this new reality. But there's a lot going on, and I just have a little bit of time to go through some of the key themes that I think will be interesting for us to explore as we embrace all of these different, not only technological advances that are happening in the background, but also what's happening in our foreground with the current situation we have all across the world. One of the things that I'd like to talk about is just some of the big changes that are happening so far. So here is a photo of San Francisco, those of you who know San Francisco. But what's interesting about this photo is that that bridge, the Oakland Bay Bridge, has no one on it because it's been shut down for so long. And we're starting to see things slowly come back. So I think I'll advance to the next slide, please. And this is what happened this is a photo I took during the shutdown, which I think was a very important photo for us to see what's happening in the reality. We have, on the surface, literally we have red bus lanes, which are a new innovation to prioritize public transport. We had green bike lanes to prioritize cycling. But then we have this telltale ad, Zoom. Who really knew about Zoom in February and March? But this has become the lifeline for the people who are working from home, and it's allowed this stopgap to allow us to actually work from home in the interim. Imagine not having this technology, we would have been in a very different situation economically for at least for one group of workers. We see the bus driver with his protective equipment, and we see this worker crossing the street with their essential protective equipment. So the world changed, and it changed very quickly, and we had to adapt into a new normal. Next slide, please. But these are the 5 key trends that are really going to shape mobility, regardless of what we have in these interim shocks. Bandwidth. Bandwidth has been the key background tool that has allowed a lot of these things to happen. And especially now, bandwidth has allowed us to basically proceed with some sort of business forward approach. Digitization has become a buzzword for the last couple of years, but I've been working with many companies around the world who had a 2 or 3 year plan that was required to be implemented in 2 or 3 weeks because of the sudden shock in our economy and so the situation with the pandemic. We saw that sharing basically was becoming much more robust, but then the shutdown kind of forced the ones that were not real to kind of vanish and evaporate. And the ones that were real are staying, redesigning, readapting, and growing forward. Electrification, the same thing. We saw that electrification was growing, and now it's become imperative, not just for the environmental performances, but also from the fleet management perspective. Electric vehicles have, 1/80th of the moving parts of an internal combustion engine. So these are big opportunities for fleet managed and shared systems. And then automation, as automation was starting to come forward, it's accelerated tremendously in the last 6 months alone because it's been pushed to do a lot more than it could do because the environment has changed, and now there's a lot more availability of and willingness to test things out and try things out. One example is an AV shared service in Florida shifted from moving people to connecting 2 hospitals and only moving essential equipment between them that people didn't want to be participating in. So already seeing use cases pop up that weren't really available before the situation ensued across the planet. Next slide, please. And so now our commute model has been disrupted. Traditionally our government and our companies and our workplaces were all about in-out, a large rush in, a large rush out. We focused on peaks, and everything that we did focused on peaks, how to get people in and how to get people out and move things around. We congregated in high density offices, whether they were high rise or low rise, they were still very intensified internally. And our infrastructure was basically designed around this in-out peak system, and all of our revenue that we get from congestion, from parking, from streets, from all these different uses, gasoline, is all designed around this peak model, and this model disrupted. So what does that mean moving forward? Next slide. So our business models in mobility have all been disrupted. We have the ownership model where we would buy our own mobility vehicle. We had to maintain it. We had to look after it. We had to, drive it ourselves. We have the ride model, which is you ride public transport, or you ride hailing, or you ride some other service where they take you around and you pay a fee to use that. And we had the rent model, which was you rent a car, a bike, e-scooter, something where you pick it up and you drop it off. But all 3 models right now are being disrupted because that no longer is the only way to do things. There is a combination of all 3 that we're starting to see, and the lines are blurring between all 3 as well. So we're going to have to start seeing new business models coming up where they can do a little bit of everything to cater to most people across the region. Next slide. And so what that means is that we can't do business as usual. We can't have business models as usual. So we can't have governance as usual. So our governance structures need to change as well. And government has always been the rule keeper or the goalkeeper of how to move around in our metropolitan areas. But there's a lot of private companies who are doing basically the similar thing. The challenge now is how do we make sure that we have some governance structure in place so that we can incorporate all of the best of the new mobility, but maintain all of the social and environmental impacts and minimize them so that we don't have this two-tiered system for the haves and the have-nots. So building trust is going to be a real key thing moving forward in all of our transportation systems, because people are very wary about should they get on public transport. Even though it's been proven that it's actually very safe to use, we have to create a messaging campaign around that. Is it safe to use? Will they be injured? We know that Sweden pioneered the Vision Zero program, but we need to move beyond Vision Zero to actually equity and safety as well. Like, will I, as a person, be safe using these services? Will I be harassed by police? You know, how will I be able to navigate these new tools? We need to look at the equity part of this, because not everybody can access these things, whether they have a physical impairment, a mobility impairment of some sort, or because they look different to you and I, and they will be targeted by certain groups or left out because they are not assumed that they can afford this service. So we need to look at these governance models in a much more effective way. And the interconnectivity piece, it's no good having a transit system that can't be connected to a scooter system or a bike share system, because we know that the three work together very well, but we need that seamless connectivity either through the mobile payment or the integrated ticketing or some sort of physical connection at the bus stops or the train stations. And it needs to be affordable. It can't just be for wealthy people or for a select group of people that we consider a charity case. We need to make sure that everybody can afford it and it actually makes sense for them to use it. It's easy, it's cheap, it's quick, and it's comfortable to use it. And it's convenient, otherwise it's not going to work. And always we can't forget the sustainability part of this, not just the environmental sustainability, which is important, air quality, noise, emissions, but also financially, can this actually work itself out? And that's where I think we need to look at a lot more structures of how can this actually work? We can't expect the transit system to run on its own when we are subsidizing the car-based system. Either everybody pays their fair share or we subsidize everything. We have to really think about what is the right price to move a person or a thing around our metropolitan areas. So the governance is going to be really critical to this, especially from a digital governance perspective of the data. How do we store the data? Who accesses the data? How do we share the data? How do we protect it? All of those things are really important as we move forward. And they'll be solved over the next couple of years, because this is where everything is moving forward on. So next slide, please. So we know that there's a new shared mobility reality moving forward. We're going to have rider protocols, how to actually ride these services, how to rent these services, trusted networks. We really need to focus on trusting with this. And we also need to look at how do we have touchless travel from A to B, where we don't touch really anything. Doors open for us, ticket systems are open for us. All of these things will be very important to build that trust and bring back people onto our systems as we get closer towards a vaccine or some sort of contact tracing system. And the reality for these services, which is what government needs to be aware of, is that they'll have to operate in this on-off model. There'll be months where we get outbreaks again. We have to turn everything off. We have to come back on again. We have to come back on with caveats and with rules. So really thinking about how do we work together is going to be a really important piece. Next slide, please. And so to close, this really comes down to partnerships. You know, we can't expect government to have all the answers. We can't expect companies to have all the answers. We know that research institutions are developing a lot of the information right now, but none of this is important if we don't focus on what the community cares about and what they need. And I think it's not a one size fits all, but it's something for everybody in the community, whether it is more bike sharing, more red bus lanes for transit, more green bike lanes for bicycling, more parking management systems, more digital curb management, all of these things, whether we price our roads in a different way or we price our transit system, whether we make transit free, All these questions can't be answered without these partnerships all put in place and understanding what is the right way to do that so that we can have full government accountability and also community and corporate accountability as we move forward. So next slide, please. So it's a really exciting time. There's a lot going on. I think we are in a crisis of all things, crisis of mindset, crisis of situation we're in, but we need to take action. And I really look forward to thinking about how we can work together. Our company works with governments, with corporates, with startups and NGOs around the world to figure out these next steps of what does the next 6 to 12 months look like, because this is not going away, unfortunately, and we're gonna have to live with it and figure out how to become more agile as we move through these next couple of phases of the next 12 to 24 months. Understand that the next decade, all of those mega trends are moving forward regardless. So it's a very interesting time to be working on this, and it's a very important time as well to not forget that the social equity piece of this is the most important thing we need to work on. So thank you so much for your time. I look forward to a great discussion with the rest of the sessions.
Thank you very much. Very interesting to hear your thoughts about the future mobility system, also reflecting on the COVID effects, of course. And we have some questions here for you, because we in Drive Sweden, we are a network, like you mentioned there, focusing on the collaboration between, as you know, academia, societal actors and the industry. And we also have now during the last years also a lot of actors that you normally don't think are involved in transport and mobility, such as banks and insurance companies, or like from the legal side. It's many of them who don't know what would my role be in the future mobility system. And you who are working with a lot of actors, how do you advise them when they are uncertain about their roles in the future system?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. It's actually one of the reasons why we work with so many of these different groups, because they all come out and say, construction companies say, what's our role in the future? Do we even need ourselves? And so, you know, we hear from all these different groups. The first thing is we always say, don't panic. This is not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to happen over a period of a decade. So we have some time to really figure out what is your core strengths? What are you really focused on that you're really good at? And what do you know about your customer base? Sometimes the answer is you actually don't know enough about your customers. Let's learn a lot more about your customers and what they care about. And then from there, we can figure out what is the potential pivot for the company. How long does that pivot take? Obviously, the more time you have to pivot, the less painful it will be for the company to turn around. But, you know, 10 years ago, I was talking to OEM saying that we're entering a shared mobility system, and you got to get ready for it. And they would laugh us out of the room. And now they call us and say, okay, you know, how do we actually do this? Because it's now serious. So, you know, it takes time. Work culture is a big part of it, changing the mindset, learning to try things out, to experiment, to see in little pockets, what can we see and do? Understanding that the company may be around for 70 or 100 years, you can't change them like that. So having a little bit of empathy about the company, its structure, understanding the signals around you, and then figuring out what is your role in this and how do we work with that. Sometimes it's actually merging with other verticals in the space to become a little bit more insulated around the issue. So it just depends. There's a lot of different pieces, but from insurance companies to construction companies to all of these different groups that are tangentially involved in the mobility system, everybody will have a role. Their role is going to be slightly different, but the time is now to understand more about what is it that you want to be and how do we get you there from here to there and what are the steps in between. That's what we basically work with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. And we've also been talking earlier when you were sleeping about the importance of involving the end users and how we can do that in practical tests and so on to really understand the needs and what the solutions should be. helping them with, so to say. So it's interesting. And I just want to ask you as well that we have earlier today been connected, as you know, with Singapore and several countries in Europe, and you are also working with a lot of actors around the world. And what do you see on a sort of a higher level? Do you see very different in the approaches towards transforming the future mobility, or is it? I mean, we have already from the start very different, maybe attitudes and settings and so on. So, is there something you can reflect on just from that more overall perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is. It's so different across the world because we're such different cultures and different societies. But the thing is, with cities especially, it's the same 5 problems, but in different scales, right? So there's congestion, there's pollution, there's equity, there's access, and there's economic development. They're all, and sustainability. They're all the same things that are bubbling in everybody's environment. It's just which levels and what's the scale. But in terms of approaches from government specifically, it's very unique that you see that in North America, it really is a push by the private sector, and the government is there to basically manage and regulate as best as it can around these things. There are some innovations coming out from government when they're trying things from an experimental perspective. And so the government tends to do a lot more experimenting, I think, in North American context. In the Asian context, there's a very strong government role, and they work very closely with industry to really start focusing more on, I would say, infrastructure. They're really pushing infrastructure. They see that as a real key moving step forward, and understanding all those other pieces in the background for society as well. So they have a much more hands-on approach, I think, with the way they do things. And, you know, as you are very well aware, the European context is like somewhere in between. Like, you know, there's a lot of push on infrastructure. There's a lot of push on social infrastructure and social cohesion. And there's also an interest in experimenting and trying some different things, not at the level, I'd say, of North America, but there's also that focus there as well. So there are these 3 interesting, like, one is very business focused, one is very government focused, and one's kind of like the happy middle. I don't know which one's the successful one. I think they all have their advantages and disadvantages. But what we're seeing is 3 really specific approaches to this. And to your point before about the society's culture that they're in will kind of determine the approach in these, and the results will speak for them based on that. But we have to be very nimble because we are approaching different governments across the countries who have very different cultural approaches to how they view their role in this, either stepping back, being in the middle, or being the driver in it, so to speak.
Yeah, very interesting. I think we'll have to meet again in 10 years and see.
Hopefully in a couple of years, we'll see the trends.
We have one question from the audience from Ingrid Skogsmo, and you mentioned equality, and are you also considering who will be offering services in all or in any area, included poorer or less well-off corners of a city? How do you tackle that?
So that's really important because a lot of these shared mobility services and these new mobility services are very profit motivated because they only have funding from the private sector, and their job is to turn a profit, and they'll only focus on the very central part of the city where there's the most people who can afford to use these services. So we have to be very careful in our mobility governance model. This is where the government of that region needs to really step in and say, wait a second, we're happy for you to provide this new mobility service. We believe, like you say, that there is an environmental benefit and that there is a social benefit, but we need to make sure that it's across the whole area, so that availability across the whole area, affordability across the whole area needs to be part of the requirement. But that's where the partnership has to be very detailed, in that understanding that economically may not work for that company. So is there a way that you can work with that company to say, we will subsidize the access in the areas that are not, according to your model, the most ideal places, so that we can ensure as a government that there is access across the whole thing. Kind of like what we do with public transit. In the central core, public transit makes money for the government, but in the outer areas and in the areas that are very lightly dispersed, the government subsidizes that even more. But the reason why they do is because we want level access across the whole area to create that equity and accessibility. It's the same with our water system and our electricity system. We just need to make sure that the government is working very closely with these private partners so that the performance of the system can be equal for everybody and ensure that no one's left behind.
Thank you very much. And I think now we have a perfect ground for our next speaker. But first, thanks again. And you can maybe stay on listening or go back to sleep, whichever you like.
I'm up now. Thank you so much. Great to be here. Bye-bye.
So now we would like to welcome Emily Eros, who is the Public Sector Tech Lead at Shared Streets and Open Transport Partnership. And they are working with pushing digitalization of the curb through standardization and collaboration in North America. So a warm welcome to you, Emily, to Drive Sweden Forum.
Great, and thank you for having me. So I'll talk a little bit about what I've been working on over at Shared Streets. Just for a little bit of context, Shared Streets is a nonprofit organization, so we're funded half by philanthropy and half by private sector partners. And what we do is build open source, free software and digital infrastructure to try to support new ways of managing and sharing data in cities. So we know that mobility and transportation have changed a lot, and there's a lot of new technology on the street. And what we want to make sure that city government have the information they need about how these new modes are operating so that they can manage streets, plan them better, and make them safer and better places for all of us. So that's the kind of work that we do. One of the central problems that we ran into is that there hasn't been a shared language for streets. So most mobility providers have their own understanding of where the street is. A city government has its own map. Uber, Lyft, Apple, Google, they all have their own understanding of the street, and it becomes very difficult to exchange data, even when parties are willing. And so one of the problems that we started off with was when maps don't match exactly, we needed a way to exchange information between them without necessarily sharing a proprietary base map. And so what we've done is built an open linear referencing model so that anyone can take their data, match it against this, and come up with a unique identifier, almost like a Rosetta Stone ID that refers to the street decoupled from that exact geography. So what we do is try to create a shared language so that we can all, the private sector, the public sector, we can all understand that we are referring to the same thing. And we also try to open up data sharing partnerships so that cities can try to get some information from companies like rideshare that maybe they couldn't have before. Another problem that we've run into is that it has been difficult to understand even just which street we're all referring to. When you layer big data on top of that, it becomes even more chaotic, and we need a way to organize information. So, all of us have sensors in our pockets. Every time we ride an electronic scooter, that's sending back trip data. And so there's masses and masses of information being generated. We have all of this data, but we've never had so little information. And so we want to make sure that when cities get access to this, they can actually work with it. Or when there's folks in the private sector that just happen to be generating data sets like this that might be useful for a city, we want to bring that back and give them ways that they can turn this into something useful. And here's an example of what that might look like. So over the last couple of years, we've partnered with Lyft and Uber in the US to aggregate and share out information about where their pickup and drop-off activity is happening in about 15 cities. And so that starts looking very similar to that last graphic of kind of noisy, disorganized information. And what we've done is snapped it to the street, aggregated it between both companies, and started to share it out in these aggregated bins where you can start to make sense of which streets are having the most pickup and drop-off activity at what times or days. And it starts to give city governments something that they can use to actually make decisions with. So this is an example from Washington, DC. They use this data set to put in some pickup and drop-off zones in nightlife areas. Other cities like Toronto have used it to find areas where rideshare vehicles are dropping off passengers in a bike lane, and they've started to think about enforcement or physical changes on the street to prevent it. So once we open up this information to city governments, there's a lot they can do to make streets better, but we need to help them do that. So those are the types of things that we work on. Over the past year, what I've been mostly focused on is data standards for the curb. Like everything else in transportation, mobility around the curb has changed a lot with scooters, with ride hail, with all of these other things. And also the way that we shop has changed. Even before the pandemic, We're seeing a massive uptick in the number of packages being delivered in cities every single day. And so this creates demand for the side of the street in ways that we didn't really see before. And so I've talked with a lot of cities who are really interested in how do they rethink how they're using the side of the street? How do they think about how they're pricing it? Or maybe they want to put in a dynamic zone where you can use it for different things at different times of the day. But first we need a map to help us do that. And it turns out that curb rules are something that are actually really difficult to map because it's not a physical geography. What we're doing is trying to think about these invisible rules for who can do what at different times and how they apply to the side of the street at different times. So that's been really difficult. And I've worked with a lot of cities that are all trying to do it in their own way, which is fine, but it means that we're getting these individual solutions. Or we're seeing private companies come in and offer to do this mapping, but they want to own the data, which is another sticking point for cities. They want this information to be open and available. So what we've been doing is working on a data standard for curb regulations. We had a lot of input from individual city governments as well as from private sector companies to figure out what are these kind of core pieces of information and how do we fit it into a way that fits for everybody. We call that curb LR. The LR stands for linear referencing, and that's available on GitHub, or there's a public-facing website if you're interested. But what it really does is just say, if we can all speak the same language and encode this the same way, we can start to build off of that, and we can build navigation apps to route someone to a parking space or a drop-off space. We could build things that will calculate a fee that's required and make that payment on someone's behalf. So it's a starting place for that. We deliberately structured this so that people could create this from any type of data collection method they want, whether it's a clipboard and a pencil or a really sophisticated Street View camera with machine learning technology behind it, or really anything in between. We've also been building some open source tools. We weren't really satisfied with any of the apps that we tried, so we've gotten a standard measuring wheel that's accurate to 0.1 meters. We've gotten that to connect up over a Raspberry Pi kind of Internet of Things device that will broadcast to a phone, and we've been building out some apps that will talk to that as another open alternative for cities. We don't really care how they create this data. We just know that there's enthusiasm and interest, and we want to make sure that they have tools available for whatever really meets their own needs. So we've been building that. And then here's what the standard looks like. So I won't get into it too much, but it's really just coordinates you can drop onto a map. That's the geometry. There's street reference information about which street are we talking about. Those are the IDs I mentioned earlier. So this means Lakeshore Drive from 51 meters to 65 meters on the left side. And then there's the who, what, when, where, who's allowed to do what, at what time, with what payment, and then an optional image to show. So that's really what's in there. It's just kind of the bare minimum to communicate to somebody like an automated vehicle or a navigation system where they can use space at what time. If the benefits of standardized data are that cities can all create this in the same way, meaning that if we build apps and tools for one city, we can start to port them over to others, just like we've been able to do with transit. And it really lets us start to create a shared understanding. So we can start to answer questions like, where can I find parking? Governments can start to answer questions about how do they allocate space? Where should they put different types of zones at what time? Freight companies can start to think about how do they make deliveries? What's the most efficient route? How do they avoid parking fines? And with the COVID era in place right now, hopefully not an era, there's even more pressure to think about, well, what parking spaces could we take away to serve restaurants and have tables out there on the street? Or how do we make room for all of these food deliveries or other type of package deliveries that are happening? So this is increasingly relevant with what's going on right now. But even outside of COVID, this is something that we really needed. So all of this brings cities to a place where they have the enthusiasm, they have the interest, but really they needed the tools to start creating these data sets and sharing them out. And so what we're really trying to do is make sure that they're at the forefront of this and can try to do this in a way that's going to meet their needs, that's going to help tame some of this chaos that we have at the curb right now and reduce friction for users. So that's what I've been working on. And I think we have a couple of moments where I'd be happy to take questions about whether it's curb management or just more broadly how we work with sharing transportation data.
Yes, thank you very much. And interesting, and it sounds like there, I mean, you show really concrete and how the cities really can benefit from this data. And what is the biggest challenge on building this open data source from your perspective?
Ooh, I think the biggest challenge is that it's almost like a chicken and egg game, where if there's enough cities producing this data, then app providers thinking about folks like Waze or Google, there needs to be enough cities to create it for them to ingest, but also there needs to be enough pressure of people demanding things for cities to actually create it and keep it up to date. And so it's almost been like a little bit of a who goes first situation, and where I'd be really excited to see more individual cities partnering with larger companies to serve it out so that members of the public know that this is something that they can ask for.
Yeah, it's often like that in innovation, I think. And earlier today, we've had discussions also about the importance of testing and developing solutions in real environments. And then, of course, the cities are crucial collaboration actors. And Timothy also talked earlier about the need for new governance models and to match the new business models that are being developed. And from your perspective, what do you think? Are the US cities prepared, and have they the organizations that are needed to meet these new services that are being developed, or to participate in all these innovation projects?
I'll start with the first question about testing. I think that's really, really important. One thing that we've done as we've been building these tools is invite cities to kind of come along and be an initial testing group. So we have a handful of cities that have these wheels that I mentioned we're building that are trying it out and giving us feedback. So that's something that we're really trying to build into our model, where we try something, we see if it works, we get feedback, we iterate again. And maybe that brings us to a better product, or maybe it brings us to a place where we realize that we need to go in a different direction, or this isn't useful for people. So that's something that we build in. In terms of governments and our cities ready, I think I've been really impressed with the quality of work that's being done around curb management in some cities in the US. So there's places like Washington, DC, or Minneapolis, or Seattle that are really at the cutting edge of trying to think about what's coming and how do they prepare for it. And I think that's really what's driven the interest in curb management, is thinking, you know, we've got a little bit of friction now, more is coming, let's get out in front of it and try different things. And there's a number of cities that have been very progressive with trying different pilots and wanting to learn from them. In terms of governance, I think things like data standards are tricky, because at first you really need something that's lean and nimble, that you can kind of make changes and bring it forward. And then as it matures, you really need a governance model where cities and private sector have a process for how they manage changes, because if we're all using it, we can't break it. And that's something where with curb management, we're still in the process of kind of bringing something out of incubation and into a more formal, mature governance model.
Interesting. And we have a question from the audience, from Patrick Hedlund at Ericsson. And he asks, in general, what has been the feedback from the mobility service providers, such as, for example, Uber or Lyft? Are they willing to share data for the good of the city?
Yeah, so in terms of pickup and drop off information, this was a voluntary pilot that Lyft and Uber undertook. It was limited in scope to about 15 cities, largely because it took engineering staff on their end a considerable amount of time to get this data and process it in a way that they could share out. So without a larger investment, it was a small number of cities that we could serve the information to. I mean, from one perspective, if a government isn't going to, or if there's a possibility that a government will legally compel a private company to do something, sometimes they try to get out in front. That's not to say that a government shouldn't compel them to share information, but this was something that they wanted to try as a way to get cities information they need, but also in a method that they felt comfortable with. One of the big challenges with trip data is that you don't want to risk revealing individual riders' identities and trip patterns. So things like, you don't want to show trips, you don't want to be able to open up the possibility of re-identifying somebody and watching their movement to a political event, a health facility, a religious center, things like that. And so we can't show individual trips, and there needs to be a methodology for how do we aggregate that? How do we make it precise enough that a city knows where on the street we're talking about, but also aggregate the trips in a way that you can't tell where people are going? And so that was a really big challenge, and I think that is at the forefront of companies' minds is they want to be good stewards of privacy. So there's all kinds of different things here between private business interests, concern for privacy, wanting to be good partners, and it's about trying to find a balance between those things.
Thank you, and I think it's very interesting, and we definitely have a lot to learn from you here, and that's why we're also very happy that we have already a collaboration that is starting up between a Drive Sweden partner, Universes. So I will thank you, and Emily, and I will give the floor to Jonathan Selby, who is the CEO, who can tell us a little bit about how you have started to talk to each other.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Emily. And we are happy to introduce that we have a newly initiated collaboration between Shared Streets and Universes, and I think that that's an excellent example of what we would like to see more of. And now when we have this collaboration with the Silicon Valley area, so warm welcome, Jonathan, CEO of Universes, to tell us more about your 3D AI solution.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sophie. It's a very great pleasure to be here. As Sophie said, I work for Universes. Just to introduce you all to Universes a little bit, you can see there on the first slide, the cityscape. It's got a number of vehicles driving around in it. They're all colored yellow. And the reason they're colored yellow is because Universes writes software to process data from sensors on board those vehicles to give them what might broadly be described as perception capability, to allow them to understand the surroundings that they're in. So we process data from cameras, LiDAR, inertial sensors, GPS as well, but we broadly solve three problems. First of all, we allow these vehicles to understand where they are in space, where they are relative to their surroundings, so their position. We also allow them to understand the 3D structure of the environment around them, the geometry, so they can plan paths and know what's around them. And then we also allow them to understand the semantic nature of the environment that they're in. So is this lump of structure that's been detected a park bench, in which case it's probably going to stay still, or is it a dog, in which case it might run out in front of the vehicle, and it's from a perception point of view, the vehicle needs to know that. And so we develop perception capability for vehicles of various different types. And a lot of our work to date has been involved with autonomous systems, so autonomous cars, autonomous robots operating in warehouses, and other autonomous vehicles that need to know about their environment so they can plan past and avoid obstacles. But what we started to do now is take all of those perception technologies and squeeze them down to run on a smartphone. And what that means is we can process data from the smartphone to give this perception capability. We can then put that smartphone into any vehicle, not just an autonomous vehicle, a taxi, a bus, a garbage truck that's already driving around the city anyway, and when we can turn that vehicle into a data harvesting agent. So these perception technologies, this computer vision and this AI that Universes has developed is used not to make a vehicle autonomous, but to gather data about the city environment to help manage the city environment in a better way. So this is the system that we're developing, and this is the type of features that we can detect. So you can see over on the left just about cleaning and maintaining the environment, how to make sure there's no graffiti and there's no leaves on the ground. People need to know this so they can know where to deploy their resources more effectively. On the next column, you have damage to the environment. Where has there been a road crack or a pothole that needs to be repaired? Where are the traffic signs that need to be maintained? Then you have big pain points like parking. If you have a number of vehicles out there with cameras in them, we can detect where there are free parking spots, for example, and all of that, and indeed where there's illegal parking. And all of this data can be fed back to a dashboard, which then allows people responsible for the environment to manage it in a better way. And then over on the right, you have very specific problems like crime and vandalism. and indeed roadworks. Where we're from in Stockholm, it turns out there are 4,000 roadworks each year. The city knows exactly where they should be, but has zero idea of where they really are. And this is a big problem for managing contractors and for understanding if they've started on time and understanding the impact of these features as well. So if you can deploy phones detecting these features, this is a big saving in terms of data, potential saving that they can make by using that data. So here we've already started, and I'll talk a little bit how Drive Sweden have helped us in a bit, but we're focusing mainly on road damage and signs and also detecting roadworks. Pretty soon we'll be able to detect features like vehicle traffic flows, but also crucially pedestrian flows as well, simply understanding pedestrian density that the camera can see as a vehicle drives through the city. And of course, this has relevance for unusual crowdings and social distancing. That's all the talk these days with COVID-19. And then in the near future, what we're planning to have is some other features focused particularly on parking, but also features where we're helping manage the environment from a seasonal perspective as well. So once we have all of those features, we then need to show that to the municipalities and to the cities so that they can act upon it. And that's where our dashboard comes in. This is our live 3D iCity dashboard that is delivering the data to the users so they can make better decisions. So all of the data that you showed on the previous slide is then structured into channels, and the municipalities can access the data in those channels to make decisions based upon them. There's also the opportunity to carry out some historical analysis. If you have all this data, it's useful to make real-time decisions, or as close to real-time as you possibly can. But it's also useful to look back in time and think, how can we improve upon our performance based on the historical data that we're gathering? The system is also set up so that you don't need to monitor it in all of the time. You can actually create alerts. And what that means, if you detect a particular feature, so a particular pothole, a particular traffic sign, you can then put alerts around it so that when another vehicle passes, it will send you an updated status report to know if something has changed and if something needs to be done about it. And then finally, there are images that we do store for confirmation purposes. It's worth talking at this point now that most of our processing is done out at the edge, out on the smartphone. It's one of our core competencies to develop this heavy lifting algorithms to run on quite low processing hardware. And what that means is we obviously save on the bandwidth transfer because we're not streaming images all the time, but we also are able to respect privacy and security because we're not streaming images all the time. We do sometimes stream images, as I said, for confirmation and for training, but at that stage, we're extremely careful to run them through anonymization pipelines to blur out faces, to blur out license plates and other personal information to respect people's privacy. So here in the dashboard, you see you can get this snapshot view of the city according to the different data channels, and you can get the images to confirm and make better decisions based on the data. So this is really the system in a nutshell. It's very simple three-step process to get up and going. We talked to municipalities today and people like Stockholm Stad, Trafikverket here in Sweden, and organizations beyond in Europe as well, about identifying which fleet. It could be a bus company, it could be taxis, it even could be the hemtjänst vehicles that we have here in Sweden. Obtaining a smartphone, downloading the app and installing it in the vehicle, and then using the same credentials that you create in the app to access the data in the dashboard. And it's really that simple, just a three-step process before you're up and running and gathering data about your environment. So this is the vision of the future where we have the users accessing the data with almost real-time data, as close to real-time data as we possibly can provide. And what that really means, the value here, is that actually you can make better use of the assets that are in the city. So actually the repair resource that you have available to mend the potholes, you can make better decisions about where that should go first. And you can deploy those resources more effectively. In the context of roads and other assets as well, it's also possible potentially to save lives. Many of the accidents in the world and on the streets today are caused by poor roads. So if we can somehow get to those repairs in a more timely fashion, then actually we can have a really big impact. But it's not just about looking backwards, it's also about looking forwards in a planning domain as well. If we can access this data and use it in vehicles like so-called digital twins, we can actually create these simulations to allow us to project forward what might the effect of changes to the city environment be. And what that means is when we're planning our cities and planning the environments in which we want to live, we can have that much better insight into the decisions we're making and how we choose to develop the city. And what it means is we can then make it that much more safe and sustainable place for us all to live. So it's not just about the cities. We also have these in mind. I think this is kind of the guiding light for a lot of municipalities and cities within Sweden and Europe as well. The global goals are really driving a lot of us now, and we've identified 4 there, which really allow us to think about carefully about how we're building the system to make sure that we're building a business that is economically sustainable, but also environmentally sustainable as well. And that's extremely important to us. And so, as I said, I've been coming back to why we're talking here at the Drive Sweden Forum. I mean, why am I telling you about this here at Drive Sweden? And I think the crucial point here is to talk that actually it was Drive Sweden who really gave us our first, lit the fire under our chairs, if you like, to really get us going. We'd had the ideas, but we applied for some funding through Vinnova and through Drive Sweden. We were lucky enough to win a project working with Stockholm Stad and working with Taxi Stockholm almost a year ago now. Deploying cameras on Taxi Stockholm taxis here in Stockholm and detecting traffic signs, detecting roadworks, road damage, and that has been happening over the summer. We have a new system that's going to be deployed again, and that's also going out with Trafikverket next week. So it's extremely exciting times here at Universes. And one of the most recent developments, as Sophie mentioned at the top, is that through again Drive Sweden, we've been introduced to the previous speaker, Emily at Shared Streets. And of course, she was talking about how to structure data that you gather about the city into a way that can be, that is useful for the management of a city, but is also possible to be shared between cities. And so we are working with it, or going to be working with Emily to structure the data that we store according to the structures that Shared Streets have developed. So using the Curb LR framework, if you like, to structure our data here in Sweden, but then potentially work with cities in the US as well to mirror the activity that we're doing here in Stockholm to demonstrate the best of Swedish and the best of the US technology working together. So that was a whistle-stop tour, I guess, of what Universes can do and the impact Drive Sweden has had on a small company based here in Stockholm, and the power of collaboration, if you like, that's been enabled by Drive Sweden. So thank you very much for having me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if that was.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. We are running a little bit behind, but I have one quick question. This day has been a lot about global challenges and sometimes related to local solutions. What about your technology? Do you see any, once you were to deploy that in, for example, Silicon Valley, would that be a major difference compared to running it in Stockholm?
Well, it absolutely depends on what you're trying to detect in the end. Unfortunately, traffic signs are not translatable between Sweden and the US. But potholes and road damage are, and so absolutely we see that depending on, and indeed parking spots are as well. So we're very excited about the different ways in which we can translate it and in which ways we'll have to adapt it. In the collaboration with Shared Streets, we're very much focusing on the ones that are easier to go international with. So very much focusing on parking actually is where we wanted to go first. And we think that's going to have one of the biggest impacts. Certainly that's in our discussions with Shared Streets, that's where we're hearing is going to have one of the largest impacts from a data perspective.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
We will hand over the leading of the next panel to Silicon Valley. Inger Gustafsson, you will share a panel in which we will have 2 of the Silicon Valley partners to Drive Sweden, RideCell and Helm.ai, joining us in a panel which will end up in a discussion about AI's applicability to sustainable mobility. So, Inger, please take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Janne. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. Still morning and dark outside here. So as Janne said, I'm heading Vinnova in Silicon Valley, and our core mission there is to support collaboration between Sweden and Silicon Valley. And I was very happy to see the collaboration between Shared City and Universes as a very good example of that. Future mobility is one of the focus areas, and that's where the Drive Sweden is a very close collaboration partner. And I'm also very happy to moderate this discussion today on how AI can be an enabler for sustainable mobility. I truly believe this is a very important topic. And when I arrived in Silicon Valley 2 years ago, I was really taken by surprise on how big AI is and how much it's driving the innovation system here. And I'm very sure that it's so important for Swedish actors to collaborate with Silicon Valley in this area, to get access to partnerships for AI knowledge, competence, and development. And today we have great speakers who will talk about this, and it's Mark Thomas from RideCell and Vlad Vorinsky from Helm AI. We're going to start off with Mark presenting RideCell, and then Vlad is going to take over. After that, we're going to have a short discussion. And please, audience, you're more than welcome to send in your questions. So Mark, very welcome. Please take it from here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. My name is Mark Thomas. I head up our alliances and marketing for RideCell. If you could just give me a hand on advancing the slides, that would be fantastic.
You should have control now.
Okay. I should indeed.
Just your arrow keys on the keyboard.
Okay, thanks. So RideCell is the leading SaaS platform for strategic partner for building profitable and scalable mobility businesses. I mean, if you think about the industry that we're trying to build, certainly some of these themes about interoperating, data exchanges, collaboration, ecosystem, all the things that Drive Sweden really is fostering require these individual actors to start and create a platform for themselves. And so what we do is provide a platform very similar to the way that AWS or Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure provide a platform for companies that want to get into the business of offering services. And so our solution lets companies get into the business quite easily. We are a company that's been around for a little over 10 years now. The name RideCell means get a ride with your cell phone. Quick background, we're about 180 people now with a $100 million investment based headquartered in Silicon Valley, but really with very strong offices in Europe, France, Germany, and Spain, as well as a R&D center in Pune, India. Some of the companies that we're helping are companies whose businesses are dependent upon private vehicle ownership. So if you think about companies that will be changing and transforming when we get to a world where there isn't private vehicle ownership, there isn't necessarily a need for an automobile club anymore. So our first customer is brought to you by the Automobile Club in Northern California, and it's called Gig. We are running a 5-city EV and hybrid car sharing service where you can rent cars by the minute, by the hour, by the day, by the week, and now even subscribe to vehicles by the month. We have also a solution from Renault called Ziddy that's in Madrid and Paris. BlueSmart is a ride-sharing service that's entirely powered with e-vehicles in India. And then most recently, we launched Kinto Share in Stockholm. And this is Toyota's European car sharing initiative, where people are able to rent a range of vehicles and check them out, schedule their reservation, check them out for an hour, or keep them for as long as a month. So it really is, automotive OEMs, understanding how they're going to be transforming their business into shared mobility. Just briefly, we power a business and operations platform that's like this mobility cloud that lets companies run consumer shared mobility offerings like car sharing, like ride hailing. Also lets companies power things like commercial shared fleets. So those would be things like corporate pools or truck sharing. With the advent of all of these deliveries, since we're in a pandemic situation, there's a need for small cargo vans, letting people use those by the shift, rent them by the hour. And then finally, now we're seeing, with subscriptions, it's become a whole new world. People want shared mobility, but the convenience of shared mobility, but they want it right now without the sharing. Certainly, ride hailing has taken a big hit because people don't want to share the car with a driver. Car sharing has really popped up as an important new direction again, and consumer subscriptions let people essentially download an app and then keep a car for as long as they want. And then finally, having the ability to integrate with partners for insurance, telematic, operations and maintenance, and even demand and delivery networks is a really critical piece to this whole mobility ecosystem. And I think we're going to see that word quite a bit, especially as we talk about AI within the ecosystem realm. All right. Again, thank you. Email is markt@ridecell.com.
Thank you very much, Mark.
You have control, Vlad.
Great. Hi, my name is Vlad Vorninsky. I'm the CEO of Helm AI. We're building scalable AI for autonomous driving and automation more generally.
Vlad, you're muted.
No, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah, I'm not muted. Yeah, so Helm AI is a hard tech play in autonomous driving, which means that we take a different approach to building all the AI software necessary for achieving full autonomy. We are ultimately an AI software company. We don't build any hardware, and we actually productize across the full spectrum of autonomy, including partial automation like L2+, ADAS systems, as well as L4, highway trucking and urban delivery and other aspects of L4, including even alternative markets such as drones and eventually consumer robots. But to start off, let me show you what our technology is capable of. So this here is going to be a demonstration of our autonomous vehicle performing autonomous steering on a steep and curvy mountain road in the Bay Area. So here we're only using one camera and one GPU, so we're not using any LiDAR, mapping, or GPS to navigate this road. And the notable thing about this, beyond the performance itself, which benchmarks very favorably against existing production systems, is actually the manner in which the system was built. So firstly, the way that the stack works here is we take in camera data from front-facing camera. We process that data with a neural network that we've trained to extract the lanes, the lane boundaries of the road, and then the rest is essentially as a classical path planning and control stack. And the notable thing is that we trained the neural network here on roughly tens of millions of images in order to get it to this level of performance. And we never actually trained on any data from this particular road. This is pure generalization from other environments. So it's actually very close to what a production level test would be for using this system. And so, the crux of doing that is that traditional AI methods would be far too expensive to use to train on that much data. The typical cost of annotation is roughly dollars per image. And so the cost of even annotating the data set that we trained on would be far too much, certainly for a small startup like Helm, but even for the large companies that are working on these problems, because there's so many different sub-problems to solve for autonomous driving. And so the key innovation on our end is a technology that's a type of unsupervised learning. So it's learning without any annotation or simulation that we've been able to master at Helm AI. And we believe that this particular approach, and just generally unsupervised learning, is going to be very critical toward getting to the finish line for L4 autonomous driving. Before we get to fully autonomous driving, there are actually many applications of our technology that are commercializable today, including autopilot type systems, so L2 plus or L3 systems for, say, highway driving and urban driving. And so this is actually here a demonstration of our autonomous vehicle, now fully automated gas, steering, and brake automation, as well as automated lane changes and navigation across 3 different highways in the Bay Area without any intervention. The only thing the human's doing is telling the car when to change lanes, but everything else is done fully automatically. This is actually the kernel of a product that we're going to be releasing relatively soon, or announcing soon. In effect, the core advantage that we're utilizing here is really the ability to train neural networks on very large data sets and get them to a higher level of accuracy than what the typical state-of-the-art would be with supervised approaches. And that leads to ultimately more functionality, much better capital efficiency for development, and a higher level of safety at the end of the day. So in order to achieve this, we, of course, had to gather a very strong team at Helm. We have people with various types of research engineering distinctions from their previous careers. Our technology has won a number of industry awards as well as research awards in the AI space and autonomous driving space. Our mission at the end of the day is to make scalable L4 a reality, which is not really the situation today. We see limited deployments of L4 autonomous driving, but scalability is very difficult to achieve. And so, as I mentioned, we believe that the first core part of our mission is to actually really reduce the cost of AI software development by potentially several orders of magnitude using unsupervised learning technology we invented at Helm. And although the endpoint for us, the end game, is fully autonomous driving, there are actually a lot of applications today of our technology for partial automation and sort of a much more deterministic go-to-market strategy in a lot of ways. In supplying this kind of software to auto manufacturers. And ultimately, we'd like to provide a full stack AI system for fully autonomous driving, which is a huge market. And there, all the core variables that are going to be important for productization are going to be driven by AI, in the sense that safety, interpretability, cost, scalability, those are all essentially a function of how sophisticated your AI stack is. And so that kind of brings the point home about why we think unsupervised learning techniques are going to be critical to maintaining market dominance in that space. So that's it on my end. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Vlad, and thank you very much, Mark. So it's really exciting to hear about what you are doing. and now we have some minutes to have a discussion. And I wanted to start off with today's topic, which is how can NI be an enabler for sustainable mobility? And I mean, you both touched upon it, but I would ask you both also to elaborate a little bit more on your views on this topic. What does it mean for you and your company? And in which way is sustainability promoted?
Yeah, happy to take a crack at that. So I mean, AI, of course, allows the automation of driving, and that's going to lead to fewer vehicles on the road due to shared mobility and things like less traffic congestion due to more efficient driving. Of course, I think everyone knows that. So it seems like on a per mile basis, sustainability is going to be improved via automation. Of course, there are other things that are a little hard to predict. In terms of it also might lead to people taking more trips in a car. But also because driving will be safer, it might be much safer to also ride a bike to wherever you want to go, and more enjoyable, not having to worry as much about vehicles. It's really going to be up to us, I think, how to use these improvements. But one unambiguous improvement I do see is the advent of contactless L4 urban delivery, which I think is going to have many positive impacts, potentially the least of which is convenience. Importantly, I think it has the potential of lowering the spread of diseases like COVID-19, for example. That's my take. I mean, Mark, would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we think about sustainable mobility, there's the long-term vision that both of us are shooting for, which is the complete transformation of how society gets from A to B. With the advent of autonomous electric vehicles that are shared, this has been part of Drive Sweden's vision of, hey, I no longer need to own the asset. Look, remember these CDs that you used to have in your living room? Nobody owns them anymore. Hey, remember all those DVDs that you would go check out? You don't need those either. And so, the long tail of sustainable mobility is in revolutionizing how we get around and switching into a much more efficient means of transportation. But what's interesting is in our business today, sustainable mobility actually means the ability for these mobility providers to sustain themselves. So many of them have been going out to market with the promise of bringing shared mobility and getting out of the private vehicle ownership, and yet many of them can't make any money, and that's unsustainable to have assets that are on the street that aren't being used. So at RideCell, it's quite a nice complement to what Vlad is building, which is teaching vehicles how to safely get from A to B. We have the mobility platform that teaches vehicles, where is that B destination? Who's getting in? At what time are they getting in? And how do those cars then keep themselves clean? How do they alert the management organization that they need to have some servicing done? And so for us, sustainable mobility and from a private sector actually has quite a bit in common in terms of incentives to sustainable mobility from an environmental perspective, because frankly, shared fleets that are electric are far more profitable to run than fleets that are based on ICE. So if we can use this as a stepping stone to get people into e-vehicles, starting the transition, not having to worry about using AI to figure out where the charging station should be, because when the vehicles are shared, they go back to a depot to be charged. So it really does allow you to use AI to fundamentally set up a business which is profitable and uses sustainable energy to run.
Well, thank you very much. So I think we changed topic a little bit. You're both members of Drive Sweden, and you're both born out of Silicon Valley. And since our audience today is mainly from Sweden, I would like to talk a little bit about Silicon Valley. And I mean, the picture is that Silicon Valley together with China is world leading when it comes to AI. So my question is it still like that? Do you share the picture? But also, how important is it for you to be in Silicon Valley? Why are you there? Why are you born there?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in Silicon Valley, so it's kind of I was always kind of taken by the culture of it, and felt pretty natural for me to settle down here. But you know, beyond that, I think there are real benefits to being in Silicon Valley. You know, from I guess like some of these things are maybe a bit outdated, but access to top talent, and of course, it's less of a factor now that everyone's working remotely, and also proximity to the venture community. And of course, the weather and location is great overall. But as far as, whether it's still kind of a leading place, I mean, yeah, I think maybe, yeah, as you mentioned, maybe Silicon Valley and China and others, for the time being, might still be leading the way, but it's clear that there are many other areas of the world that are quickly catching up. I do think Silicon Valley has, a certain staying power with so many top companies having been formed here, but there seems to be a bit of an exodus, and maybe like certainly a collection of innovation hubs popping up in a lot of places. And so I think kind of the next location, the leading nexus is sort of up for grabs.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, we were started in Atlanta, and the company, when it was about close to 2 years old, realized that one of the reasons it needed to move to Silicon Valley was for access to capital. And, Sand Hill Road is to venture capital what Wall Street is to the financial markets. So that in and of itself really helped the company move from, an idea into one that's, now successfully raised 100 million. But it's also the days of having a solution that will scale, yet having it be entirely dependent upon, a startup company's ability to build it are gone. This is about an ecosystem now. And if you, look at the companies that have invested in RideCell as a part of the ecosystem, there's tier ones like Denso, Cox Automotive, one of the largest dealer servicing groups, OEMs, insurance companies. All of these have to come together because it's not just transforming the auto companies' business and future, it's transforming all the companies that are part of that ecosystem. And we mentioned, the Auto Club, for instance. So it's, Silicon Valley as a ecosystem hub, apps and as a VC hub are critical. But Vlad's point, we're in a strange environment today with the pandemic. All of us tech workers are working from home. And there's a realization of, hey, our productivity hasn't dropped that much. Certainly there's some people that need to be in the office, but now I think companies are rethinking what is the requirement to have all of the employees in Silicon Valley. Can we have places set up where there's talent pools in Colorado or Boise or Montana, where the cost of living is less, and people can still be just as productive. So I think we'll see more of a disparate kind of organization that will remain after COVID goes away.
Vlad and Mark, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Time is running out. And I'm going to head over to Janne. But again, thank you so much for getting up early in the morning. Thank you for being members of Drive Sweden, and thank you for collaborating with Sweden.
Thank you. Bye.
And thank you, Inger, for leading this panel. I'm so excited hearing about these stories. Two quite different companies, but still on a very exciting path for the future. Hopefully, we can help bringing more of our partners into that bright perspective. And actually, we are looking all the time to find new ways of promoting our partners' abilities in the world. We just launched a new initiative that I will invite Martin Jönsson from Business Sweden to tell you a bit more about there. So please, Martin.
Thank you. Well, really excited to be here. And my name is, as you heard, Martin Jönsson, working at Business Sweden and oriented to the smart transportation. Regarding, I'm really excited about this SME initiative, and interesting to hear about the companies before, which is really right into this area. And so Drive Sweden is introducing this SME platform now. And why are they launching this? Well, there have been coming in a common request from the members that introducing this platform that will help them. And as you see here, almost half of the members are SMEs. And what we can see is that with joined forces, you create a much larger impact for when you try to reach out as an SME instead of coming up as your own company, reaching public authority, reaching large corporates. So this is really an important area, and I think also to get the international exposure and to understand the competitive landscape is really important when you start as an SME and start to grow. As you also know, SME sector is really important for the growth of Sweden, and this is also something that we would like to promote. So an important factor also to do this. And we see that Drive Sweden can provide a very large ecosystem which all the SME can benefit from. So I think this is really an important area, the grasp, an opportunity to grasp. Then we have Business Sweden, which has a global reach. And here you can see a little bit where we are, 50 offices around the world. And Business Sweden...
Maybe you should, with 2 words describing what is Business Sweden compared to Drive Sweden, because it's...
Yeah, good remark. Well, the purpose of Business Sweden is twofold. One part is to help and support Swedish companies to grow their global sales. And the other part is to support international companies to come to Sweden, invest and establish in Sweden. So this also gives a great opportunity to exchange between the different SMEs, international as well as Swedish ones. And also the other ones, why we see the exchange between corporates and SMEs. There is a good opportunity to join this platform, to be able to exchange with the large corporates. And I think the collaboration is the key of the future. You need to take advantage of different companies' capabilities to keep up the pace of innovate and be competitive. And what will it consist of? When we see the Drive Sweden the initiative will be driven by Drive Sweden and also Business Sweden, co-moderated. Will be ongoing activities throughout the years, 2 to 4 activities throughout the years. An example of activities are marketing activities on global events, also common efforts of lifting out technology research and innovation solutions out in the world. We see also an important area to help companies to grow, scale up discussions, how to raise money, how to evaluate your company. And of course also the lunch and learn that you have initiated now, which is also a really good area. And we also see this is an important to be driven by the members and partners. So interested to hear all the propositions from the partners to how we can elaborate this and build it for the future. So if you're interested in this and joining this platform, contact me. And it's only for the members or only for the partners, but please contact me. We'll be happy to have you on board on the platform.
And we should make it clear that this is also open not only to our Swedish partners or as Swedish SME partners, but also to our international SME partners. So they're equally welcome into this platform.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Good.
thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much.
And please get in touch with us at the either Martin or Drive Sweden program office if you want to be part of this activity.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Sophie, it's time to close.
Yes.
It's been a very long day, but hopefully you also found it very valuable. The theme for today was transformation of the mobility system being a global challenge. And I think having virtually traveled the globe since this morning, we've learned that there are plenty of global challenges out there. We also have learned that some of them require local solutions, and that may be hard to combine sometimes. But my conclusion is that we need to stay focused on the global collaboration as a sort of an overall step in this approach, but again, at the same time, remaining laser focused on really finding the local solutions that meets the user need. Because no matter how good global collaboration methods or solutions we come up with, they need to fit the local needs, and that's where they need to be adapted there. It's obviously a difficult challenge to combine those two, but it's also a very interesting challenge and one. And I like to think that the Drive Sweden short partnership is very well suited to that. We have the international partnerships, the international partners, adding competence and skills from all around the world. And hopefully that will be a mutual, very benefit cooperation going on between the Swedish and international partners. In return, I think we can offer a lot of things from our typical Swedish way of collaborating across government agencies and industry and academia. So all in all, I'm very hopeful after this day that we have at least set the base for taking this one step further into defining those local solutions based on global solutions or global methodologies to find.
Yes.
So
yeah, well, I can only agree, and I'm also very glad that we were able to connect with so many today. And so the technique is fantastic sometimes, even though I hope that we can also meet physically perhaps next time and have also the chats within in the breaks. But I would also like to just remind you about our two roles that we have in Drive Sweden. So keep an eye out for our program activities. We run a lot of events around the thematic areas where we dig deeper into all of the subjects that we have been discussing today. And together with our project portfolio, where we fund both open calls and strategic projects, we work intensively to solve joint challenges and find solutions to a more sustainable, accessible and safe transport system. So as final words, I would just like to say a big thank you to all the fantastic speakers, to our back office crew with Josephine and Peter in charge, but many of you as well together with them. And last but definitely not the least, the audience. And note the date for the next Drive Sweden Forum, the 28th of January. And we'll get back to you in what format we will run this one. If you want Smart Mobility newsletter every Friday, sign up on our website. And with that, we would like to say good night, Asia, good evening, Europe, and good morning, USA. And the conclusion is that Drive Sweden never sleeps. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.